Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining tonight's Region 2 Stakeholder Advisory Committee meeting for Anne Arundel County. We're very, very excited. We apologize for starting a little late. We're getting everybody settled here. I'm Joe Franco, Chair, and we have our SAC members as well as our speakers tonight. And our call this night is going to be focused on affordable housing, which is a topic that is top of mind, I think, for everybody in our country. As we are seeing housing shortages, and then we're also seeing fluctuations in the housing market and interest rates for mortgages. So I think there's lots to talk about this evening. So we will go ahead and get moving on that end. So with that, we have sent the agenda out to SAC members ahead of time, and they've been able to review that. So I just want to confirm the agenda, and if I could have a motion to approve the agenda, maybe from Keisha.
I move to approve the agenda.
Great. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Kevin. All right. Thank you, Kevin.
Great.
Excellent. And then previously, before this meeting, Carrie graciously sent around the September SAC meeting notes. Are there any changes we need to make to those? Any additions? No? Okay. Do we have a motion to approve those?
I move to approve it.
Great. Keisha moves to approve.
I second.
Okay, and I'll do Patience. I'll give it to Patience, I think. Great. So with no objections, we will approve our September SAC notes. Excellent. So with that, we will just going to kind of go ahead and roll right in just because we're running a little bit behind. But like I said, tonight's topics, we're going to really talk and dig deep into affordable housing and what that means, and then also talk about what we can do as an SAC to make recommendations. So that way we can have proper workforce housing, we can have housing for low-income older adults, as well as just for low-income residents in the Region 2 of the SAC. So with that, we're really excited to welcome back Michael Stringer from the Office of Planning and Zoning. He graciously joined us when we did our environmental one our in-person meeting, so he should look familiar to a few folks as he was one of the facilitators. So with that, Michael, I'm just going to turn it right over to you so we can get cranking.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
And I appreciate the interest of this group coming together on this topic. Tonight's meeting is all about, as you said, digging in deeper on this topic of affordability and housing options and diversity. And this has been a meeting that is requested from this group, asking so many questions about it. So we've brought in some additional experts who will follow up from me, some great developers in the affordable housing space, but to give you some real world experience and their on the ground knowledge about how to make these projects come to life. And I'm going to give a little bit of intro to that. I want to cover two topics that have both been frequent conversation pieces for this group: missing middle housing and then affordable housing. So we'll talk about missing middle first, then get into affordable housing, then hand it off to our affordable housing developers to talk a little more in depth about that. As we start, it's important to kind of work out our definitions and our terms here. With affordable housing and missing middle, terms are pretty broad and can cover a lot of ground. For affordable housing, we talk about different levels. The question of affordability is always relative to income, right? What's affordable to some is not affordable to others. Missing middle, including things like duplexes, quadplexes, accessory dwelling units, is another broad term. It can overlap with affordable housing in that these missing middle housing forms are typically smaller and therefore usually more affordable than a single family detached home. But they're not required to be affordable to low income. It's not kind of part of the definition of that term. People often talk about with missing middle housing the term attainability, and that focuses more on housing options for different income levels, different family types, different stages of life, versus affordable housing, usually focusing very specifically on different levels of income and affordability for those levels of income. Slide, please. So when we talk about missing middle, this is a term that's relatively new to the planning discipline. It was coined in a book of the same name about 10 years ago. But it really refers to kind of a traditional housing form, which we see in a lot of older communities, including just looking down the street in Annapolis. The idea of missing middle gets to the scale and form of housing, kind of between the single family detached house and then the 5-story apartment building. And as this picture shows kind of that spectrum of, it includes things like duplexes, quadplexes, so things that look like a single family home, a large home, but divided into different units, as well as some other interesting forms like cottage houses, where you might have multiple houses small houses on one large lot with shared open space between them. Or looking at small apartments, things that might be 2 or 3 stories tall, have 5 to 12 units in them. And it's interesting, kind of historically, these housing types used to be common in old towns, but the development of our modern zoning regulations that are so based on density, they really segregated these things out, and changes in the marketplace as well really have led to the point where these housing types have not really been developed much in the last 40, 50 years. Slide, please. Missing middle gets a lot of interest in spaces like this because of the potential that it gives for housing options that allow compatibility with existing single-family residences. So that's what this diagram is depicting, that over on the left, you kind of have a traditional layout for a single-family block. You've got houses there, a couple of garages and backyards, or sheds and backyards. And on the right, you see a picture with some buildings in yellow or blue that show how missing middle forms can be kind of brought into that kind of setting. So you see in some of the smaller yellow buildings might be ADUs, so accessory dwelling units. Some of those larger yellow buildings could be triplexes or quadplexes, where it's like a large home, but again, divided up either horizontally or over the different stories into different units. And then to kind of have a transition space with some of those smaller apartment style buildings on maybe a main street or an arterial road. So a lot of communities around the country are looking at this as an opportunity to say, how can we get more housing options into our existing neighborhoods in a way that's compatible with that physical form, and kind of it gets away from some of the impacts that are perceived negatively around larger scale housing developments by spreading it out more. Okay, slide please. So we handed out a briefing document before the July housing meeting for this group that had some information and pictures of different types of development, including a little section on missing middle. So I'm going to give you a quick reminder of some of that by going through just some pictures of what some of these housing types look like. These are 2 examples of what we call fourplexes or quadplexes. And the idea is just that 4 units in one building. The picture on the left shows them kind of horizontally. So one long building, you can see the 4 garages and driveways. So 4 separate units, but in one structure. And this is actually a form that's becoming common in some of our, or not uncommon, in some of our senior 55 and over communities. This picture is actually from the Two Rivers development near Gamrells and Odenton. And then on the right, you can see how that form can look in a taller building where you've got 2 units on the bottom floor, 2 units on the top floor, so 4 units in this large building, a driveway on the side for parking. And this is a common form in a lot of older communities. I went to undergraduate at Rutgers, and the town that was in had a lot of these kind of units, and they were great housing for grad students, for recent graduates who are kind of just getting started. And again, it integrates right into a residential neighborhood and fits the scale and form, the look of a house. Next slide, please. And at the higher end of the missing middle, we get into small apartments. So these can look like, again, just large houses. This one kind of looks like a school to me on the left. And again, divvied up into individual units, usually between, say, 5 and 12. So kind of smaller scale than what we usually see in an apartment. And these often can be a nice transition from single family to higher density areas. Okay. Slide, please. And then there's a lot of public conversation too around accessory dwelling units. City of Annapolis has just revamped some of their rules around this. A lot of communities have been around the country. And these are where you have a small secondary housing unit on the same lot as a single family house. They typically are independent, so they have a bedroom, bathroom, a kitchen in that space. They can be inside the house, so the picture on the left kind of shows it above a garage, or as a separate structure, like the picture on the right. These are allowed in Anne Arundel County Code as being inside the main structure. So you can do the apartment over a garage or a finished basement in Anne Arundel County. But we do have pretty strict limits about the floor area. It can only be a third of the size of the main house, maximum of 1,000 feet. They're not very common around here in this county. But as I said, a lot of other counties are looking at adding this in or have been. Especially the idea of making them separate and trying to, since this typically is done by a individual homeowner, trying to make the permitting process for this very streamlined as well. City of Seattle actually recently came out with a website where you can click on your parcel, see if you're allowed to have a ADU, and then they actually contracted with local architects to create a pattern book, and there's 10 or 12 templates that you can basically pick a design, and then buy that copyrighted design and kind of go right away to permitting and construction pretty fluidly with that. Next slide, please. So there's some important considerations with missing middle. It is a great option of looking at increasing diversity in housing choice, but again, it's not necessarily affordable. If you build that ADU in the backyard, there's no requirement that it be leased for anything less than a one-bedroom apartment would be somewhere else in the neighborhood. Since it is a form that's become uncommon, there's going to be some supply issues as communities start to adjust their regulations to make this allowable. Developers don't have a lot of experience with it. Lenders haven't put loans out on these products. So it's going to take some time for the market to adjust, figure out how to price it, how to figure out how to deliver these. And in jurisdictions where they have been approved, these aren't, they're not changing the entire landscape of communities, right? They're coming on as, a few units here, a few units there. I think that's an important theme as you have your affordability discussion, is that, there's been conversations ongoing across the country in local governments for over a decade now about how to try to promote more housing choice, more affordability. And everybody seems to come to the same idea that there's no silver bullet. We need a lot of different strategies that are targeted for these different things. So missing middle could be a good option to target for that kind of attainability, for kind of middle income, different stages of life, ways to kind of be able to diversify our existing neighborhoods, but it's not going to be, again, the great solution for affordability. And to be able to make these things allowed to be permitted in the county, it will require some significant code changes. Density is kind of the big one, right? Our zoning codes, since they were adopted in, nationwide underneath the kind of codes in the 1920s, and Anne Arundel County adopted theirs in the 50s, they're really based on this idea of density. How many housing units per acre of land? And that's how we stratify and categorize things. With the idea of missing middle, you're talking about putting, 4 units of housing next to single families. So it really kind of defies that density number. So in jurisdictions that are looking to fix that, sometimes they'll just put a outright, say this is permitted and allowed by right in different zoning districts. This is what you see when like the state of Oregon passed a state law requiring local governments to allow duplexes and triplexes in basically any zone. Or they, at times will just take that density out and say, what, in that zoning code, there's also provisions that say how big a lot has to be, what the setbacks from a parcel has to be, from the parcel lines has to be. And that by itself defines that density. So you can kind of use those measures and not worry about the density number for the zones that you want to apply this. Another challenge is parking. You saw in that quadplex picture, you got 4 units, you kind of have a skinny place for a driveway, maybe parking in the back. But the typical requirements for putting parking on the same site as the house really starts to limit the ability to maximize use of that lot. So local governments are looking to solve that by saying, hey, maybe we don't require all the parking to be on the parcel, allow some of the parking to be on the street. And if the neighborhood has space for that, or if it's an area near transit, reduce the parking requirements. So that's an opportunity to think about too, potential ways to identify locations near transit where parking can be reduced. And those lot dimension standards I mentioned, things like setbacks and widths, sometimes need to be adjusted to allow the flexibility for these houses. Okay. So with that, I'd like to transition back to the affordable housing piece. Again, thinking that missing middle is kind of its category, and then affordable housing as we transition to the private developers. I want to give a little bit of context around some of the framing for what they do around those income limits, as well as the regulatory process for developing affordable housing. So slide, please. So affordable housing, there's a lot of terminology that goes into this. We kind of all have an intuitive sense of what affordable is. Affordable means I can afford it without really stretching myself. I'm feeling comfortable making that rent payment or that mortgage payment. As a rule of thumb, state and federal policy for years has used the idea of that housing costs shouldn't exceed 30% of the household income. We don't have an actual definition codified in the county code for what affordable means, but that's typically what gets referenced when you're thinking about funding programs specifically designed for affordable housing. And when you see analysis of who is rent burdened, who is burdened by housing costs. And when we think about affordable housing, we have kind of two types. There's naturally occurring and there's deed and income restricted. So naturally occurring is just housing that is lower priced relative to the area. So for example, South County, typically the housing is lower priced than what it is, say, near Annapolis. And that's an important part of the housing stock, of course. Then deed and income restricted gets to what we talk about with, as the speakers will say in a moment, when they've got funding or regulatory requirements that say so many number of units of this kind of housing will be affordable to this income level. And there's typically a restriction put on the deed that's going to carry forward between different renters or buyers of that property that's going to maintain that restriction on the unit. We have this baked into the Anne Arundel County Code in our workforce housing legislation that was passed just a few years ago. And that piece of code was designed to help promote workforce housing in the county. And so it sets up thresholds for between rental units and owned units at different levels of affordability. So for rental units, it says that you can take the advantage of the benefits of this part of code if 60% of those units can be occupied by households making no more than 60% of AMI. Oh, sorry, that's for rental. And then for ownership, it's 40% of those units occupied by people making 100% of the area median income. And this difference between rental and owner levels is typical for these kind of regulations in recognition that you need to have a higher income level to be able to own versus rent. So this term area-wide median income, this ends up becoming the benchmark that a lot of these things are based on. And for the Anne Arundel County area based on the Baltimore Metropolitan Statistical Area, our current area median income is $116,100. And that's really high compared to most places in the country. I think statewide, even for the state of Maryland, is at about 87,000. And even that's high compared to a lot of the country. One that's important to think about when you look at that number is that's for household. And this number is based on a household of 4. So think about that being 2 income earners, so the combination of 2 incomes to be at that space. Slide, please. And when you get into the programs like we just showed with the county's workforce housing or with these financing programs that'll get mentioned by the next speakers, they set levels based on that area-wide median income. So for federal programs through the Housing Urban Development Department, HUD, targeting very low income, they target that at half of the area median income. And you can see that for a family of 4, that's about $58,000. And they adjust this based on the size of the household. Okay, slide, please. And we want to put this in the sense of scale too, of how many people in our communities are at these levels. So this slide takes those same rows of showing the very low income, the rental income threshold for our workforce housing bill, and the ownership threshold for the workforce housing ordinance, and shows how many households in the county and then in region 2 fall into those categories. So you can see in the upper right that about 2,300 households in region 2 are at that very low income threshold. That's about 13% of the population there. So it's a significant number of people that are affected by this. Okay, next slide, please. And then to look at this in another way, this infographic kind of starts to put the picture on, okay, what kind of jobs are people working at to get salaries to be at these income levels? Because these are working families. So this diagram shows kind of a spectrum at the top that goes, those red lines are the percent of area median income from 0 on the left to 110 on the right. And then the numbers that you see below are icons for the household size from 1 to 4 people. And then at the top, you can see some different typical salaries, typical incomes for different jobs. Fast food and counter workers at about $24,000 per year at the low end of the spectrum. Middle school teachers at about $62,000 per year between the 70 and 90%. And up to police officers and civil engineers up in the 90 and close to 100 percentile. So you can kind of see that, this is also always an important thing to distinguish with affordable housing. I think when the term gets brought up, people think of people who might be on welfare and not even employed. But really, this housing is often targeting people who are employed, just at jobs that are not paying enough of an income to be able to afford housing in this area. Okay, slide, please. Now, going to the regulatory side of this and kind of the development process, affordable housing is still housing. They still have to go through the same permit process as a traditional market developer. So as a kind of quick 101 for that development review process, this diagram shows the major steps that a housing project would go through. You'll see on the top in green lettering there is what happens when you have a subdivision. So you've got a large lot. It needs to be divided up into smaller lots for different houses or townhomes. And they go through a two-step process of going from a sketch plan to a final plan. And those plans show the general layout of those lots, where the roads, the infrastructure, the utility lines are going to go, how stormwater is going to be managed. It will address the natural resources on the site, where there are forests, where there are streams and wetlands, how are those going to be protected. There are community meetings before a sketch plan is submitted, and then after the final plan is submitted to the county. And once those are approved, then they can go forward and get the grading permit and building permit, which are a little bit more of an administrative function. They still have their own complexities and a lot of requirements, but a little bit less public process involved. If it's a site that you already have a legal lot to build on, say it's going to be a apartment, you've already got your lot, then you go into that process that's on the bottom side, where we call it a preliminary plan and a site development plan. And they'll have similar levels of, they'll have their details on those plans of what's the building scale going to be, where it's going to be located, how the utilities and infrastructure are going to serve it. And also there are those community meetings required before a preliminary plan is submitted, and then right after that site development plan is submitted to the county. And when these plans come in, they get reviewed against our zoning code, and that has our requirements about what kind of uses can go in which zoning districts, as well as those issues about scale and density. They also have to be reviewed against our natural features requirements, so protections of forests, streams, wetlands, steep slopes, et cetera. Our stormwater management requirements, and adequate public facilities testing, which will get discussed in more detail later. But this is where you hear about getting a traffic study done, or looking at whether the schools are open or closed. Is this housing development going to create more students for the school? Those tests also go for water as well as fire to make sure that those infrastructure systems can support the project, and if not, what mitigation measures are going to be taken to do that. Next slide, please. One thing that gets challenging in particular for affordable housing projects is that while they're going through this process of permitting, they're also doing the process for financing. And they need to go out and get grants or low interest loans. The low income housing tax credit is really a major program for supporting a lot of these projects. And those have timelines when the application period happens, when you need to have then, if you're lucky enough to get the funding, to meet milestones along the way of that grant process and to be able to meet that. So projects can get hung up between the permit process, maybe causing a delay that then causes people to lose funding. And as the speakers will talk about in a moment, there's a really complicated stack of different kind of funding sources that need to come together for these projects. So those tensions between those two processes can really be challenging for projects to overcome. Slide, please. The county has actually in recent years adopted some legislation to try to help that process a little bit, specifically around that low income housing tax credit, where the county council passed a reform to our code that allowed an exemption for projects that receive those particular funds. So not all affordable housing, just the ones that get this particular funding source. If they are less than 50 housing units, and if at the time they apply for those tax credits, the schools are open based on these standards, based on state rated capacity. That's kind of the, as you've heard about in previous presentations, that's kind of the benchmark for our school's capacity, is looking at that state rated capacity. As for standard development for elementary and middle schools, that's set at 95%. And they allow a little more flexibility for these low-income housing tax credit projects to go up to 98%. And similarly for high schools to go from the standard of 100 to 105%. And if projects take advantage of this lenience flexibility in the code, they do have to put a deed restriction on the project for 30 years and have this threshold of 60% of the units being occupied by households earning less than 60% of the area median income. Slide, please. I mentioned also that the County Council passed the workforce housing legislation in 2019. This also was a way to try to promote more affordability in housing. We talked about earlier those definitions of affordability for ownership at 100% of area-wide median income and renting at 60%. And what this did is it allowed some more flexibility in the uses, saying in these different zones where like C1, the commercial 1, 2, 3, even 4, and the industrial W1, that workforce housing could be allowed as a conditional use. And similarly in the R5 and R10 and R15 zones, and that those 5 and 10 and 15 basically refer to units per acre, 5 units per acre, allow them to build up to 22 units per acre to be able to make a more financially feasible, larger development on those sites. And that's kind of a fundamental principle with affordable housing is typically, getting into that multifamily setup where it can be, a small apartment building leads to just cost efficiencies per door, per bed. So being able to have increased density, be able to build that more cost efficient unit becomes a real assistance for those projects. Interesting though too, like each of these kind of, if time you reform a code, there's always a little bit wrinkle too. What's interesting about this is, it allowed these benefits if you're a conditional use, but if you're developing these just in an R22 zone by right, these additional provisions don't apply, which becomes a wrinkle for some projects also. Okay, so next slide, please. So in the July meeting you guys had on housing, you discussed potential policy ideas, recommendations, things to do to try to promote housing. And these sticky notes here show some of those ideas, and we'll talk more about those. Carrie or Mark, do you want to take over and kind of introduce that discussion and introduce the next speakers?
Yeah, so before we get into the speakers, the SAC members were sent a link for this Jamboard. And again, this was an opportunity. I think everybody's familiar. We've used the Jamboard before, where it's just a great opportunity or space for us to throw some ideas down. So we've included some of the ideas down on that slide too, but we're really looking for then, as we hear the presentations by the presenters, that if there are some nuggets of ideas, feel free to put those down on that Jamboard that you have the link to. In the background, and we'll come back to this then later in the meeting as well. Okay, Carrie, did I miss any other instructions then?
No, you're good.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, so great. Let me, so we have from Homes for America, we have Diane Clyde, and from Foundation Development, we have Jessica Zuniga. So,
okay. Good evening, everybody. I think I'm gonna. Oh, great! I was gonna say, do you have the PowerPoint, because I'm not sure I'm ready.
I have all the new slides even loaded in.
Yeah, just let us know into advance.
All right, sure. Go ahead in advance.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm Jessica Zuniga. I'm from Foundation Development. We are currently an active developer in the county, and I have some pictures towards the end. Diane and I both have some projects to share with you all. Our current project is actually in Region 2, so I'll be excited to tell you all about it. And it hits on a lot of the topics that I'm going to talk about tonight. Just a little bit of background on me so that you can understand maybe the depth that I'm going to talk about some of these issues. I was on the Anne Arundel Affordable Housing Coalition board for a very long time. all through the workforce housing conditional use and special exception processes. And so I've really been engaged in some of these issues for a while, and I currently do sit on the school APFO work group in the county. Carrie or Michael, I'm not sure. Mark, who's advancing me. Thank you. So I think the first thing I want to talk about, and I don't think this is going to shock anybody, land is scarce in the county for affordable housing. The county does not have a lot of high density zoning. It is one reason why the workforce housing conditional use was done. There is very little R22 that is not built on in the county. And even if it is left, if it is large, it is expensive because market rate developers would like to have it for obvious reasons that living in the county is a desirable place to be. And the rents are very high if you're a market rate developer. So we cannot afford to pay what they can pay. Affordable housing communities tend to be smaller. So we are looking for smaller size land, but we do need density. And, for example, R22 in the county, it is 22 dwelling units per acre, but you're only allowed 65% lot coverage. So that, you're talking about a pretty sizable piece of land to get 60 or 80 units. So it's just really not available in the county. I think, kind of the same issues with R15 and R10, which do allow multifamily as well. But again, you're at an even lower density with even higher lot coverage or an even lower percentage of lot coverage. So it's really R22 is the only option. So we've covered acquisition costs with just the idea that land is expensive in the county, period. And if we find high density ground, we're going to pay a lot for it. When you move to the conditional use, for the workforce housing and our project Eagle Park, which I'll tell you a little bit more about tonight, I think is the furthest ahead as the first project with the workforce housing conditional use. It was a really interesting experiment. We are taking a piece of MXDR that was already a part of approved mixed use plan, which was its own unfortunate incident. It was previously programmed as office. But, what we're finding is, being able to find ground, the MXDR is actually 7 dwelling units per acre. That's what the underlying zoning is. But now we're putting essentially R22 on it. It is not currently subject to the change with the Forest Con bill. I believe it was 6819 that really changed Forest Con. This was previously approved, so it took advantage of the old Forest Con legislation. But we would not be able to build what we're building there today if we had to use the current Forest Con legislation. So the workforce housing conditional use, I think, is really important, but now you're talking about sites that are not necessarily in areas that were meant for residential. They may not be meant for that type of density originally. So we have, I wouldn't say we have a sewer capacity issue, but we do have a sewer line issue where the line is not large enough to serve a residential use of our size. So we're trying to work through that with OPZ. So I think, it's sort of, as I said to Michael and Carrie and Mark, when we all met before this, it's, you're kind of trying to take a square peg and shove it in a round hole because that really wasn't the original land use intention. And we're figuring out ways to make it work, but it's expensive. And that's a real challenge for the affordable housing budgets. And so that, that's sort of, with the conditional uses, I think, there are some questions about some sites, frankly, being suitable for that level of density for residential and also just residential in character. And then, there are some requirements for the by right conditional use. I mean, you need to be on a state road or a major artery road, for example. So that's not going to apply. That kind of knocks out a number of land options. So to the point is there's just very little options to put affordable housing in the county with any real density. Next slide, please. So I know we kind of touched on this earlier. We do have to meet all the same regulations that any other development does. And that, I think Forest Con is a really important one that I mentioned. I mean, that was a really big change to available density on existing ground. If you have trees, that it just dramatically changed how much density can actually be available. So that just lessened what the county already had available. I think, there's a number of interesting things about the county's code. I think it's truly a suburban code. I think it's fair to say it's a suburban code. And now when you're starting to deal with these smaller parcels and even infill and redevelopment, the county's code is not necessarily responsive to some of the unique parcels that affordable housing finds itself with. We find ourselves with a lot of odd pieces of land, unique shapes, redevelopment, different things. So I think that is one thing that I would mention as something that should be considered, is just the idea of trying to find a way for oddball and redevelopment type sites to get approved, because I think that's really primarily what the county has left for affordable housing, or at least to increase the options for affordable housing. APFOs, I don't think the school APFO issue is shocking to this group. I think there are 2 districts in the county that are completely open, and the other ones are either completely closed because the high school's closed, or the middle school's closed and there's only one middle school, or you might have the unfortunate situation of having your elementary school's closed. You're not doing a general occupancy project. And we actually changed our project, Eagle Park. We actually changed it to 48 general occupancy units and 72 senior units. Our intention was to do 120 general occupancy units. But when we applied for funding, the legislation that Councilmember Lacey did only allowed 50 units, and we had seen a preview of the school chart. So we were able to apply knowing that, we would have the schools open up to 50 units and we would be able to take advantage of that exemption. But the schools were promptly closed even before we got our award for funding. But we were able to take advantage of the existing legislation, but it's only 50 units, and it's only if the schools are open, and they're currently really not open pretty much anywhere. And so that really limits the county's options of where it can actually put family housing, family affordable housing, which I would argue is truly what the county needs. The county has a long history of senior affordable housing, but not family affordable housing. And one of the other unique things, and I think, I'm going to let Diane talk more about just sort of our financing and some of the uniquenesses to it. But again, one of the things that I discovered in this Eagle Park project, and trying to shove a round peg or trying to shove a square peg in a round hole, we had an age restricted component and we had a family component on a single parcel. That is not allowed in the county. You have to actually have separate parcels, separate entrances, separate facilities. So we've had to subdivide the parcel and provide for 2 different entrances, and everything is completely separate, and that's required by the code. What we have been able to do in other jurisdictions is to do a land condo, but that would not have met the code in the county. So it's frankly additional cost to the affordable housing communities, both of them, just to create that separateness. So that is a component with age restriction. So you cannot have general occupancy and age restriction on the same parcel in the county code. And the county will continue to see more projects like this because the state is actually incentivizing 2 separate phases financed. That they're financed separately, but they go at the same time. So they're actually awarding us 2 separate sets of financing with 1 application. So it's what they refer to as a twin. And so Eagle Park is a twin. And so we have 2 separate financing packages. And because of the schools, one side is age restricted and one side is general occupancy. And we're subdividing the parcel because the county requires it. Next slide, and I'll call up Diane.
Hello, everybody. My name's Diane Clyde, and I am the Executive Vice President of Homes for America. We are a nonprofit affordable housing developer headquartered in Annapolis. We've been in business for approximately 27 years and own about 70 properties throughout Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Delaware. Most of our properties are in Maryland since we're headquartered in Annapolis, and we like to call ourselves a hands-on owner. So we typically don't develop any properties that are further than 3-hour driving time from our office. We use third-party management companies to manage our properties. We're very sensitive to providing resident services for the populations that we serve. So we have on-staff resident service coordinators, to make sure that we do provide the best services that we can. We typically provide housing for seniors, families, and special populations with special needs. So I think we own about 6 properties within the county. I believe we have one in your district. It's a Burger Square in Odenton. It's a 48-unit property. Just to talk a little bit about the financing for affordable housing. I started my career at the Housing State Finance Agency. So I used to allocate the low-income housing tax credits and the soft funds that went along with those tax credits until I recently, I think I've been over on the development side for about 12 years. And I can tell you it's much more challenging being on the development side than it is on the funding side. As was described earlier, we provide housing for residents that are 60% below the area median income. And as a nonprofit developer, we do not have a mixed income property. We typically provide housing for 60% and below. And we try to reach down to the very low income folks in the county and the state, which is, anywhere from 30 to 50% of area median income. So we typically have maybe 3, 4, 5 different arrays of funding, whether it be loan funds or grants. And all of those funding sources have their own regulatory requirements that we have to fit into. I think that the most important funding program is the low-income housing tax credits, which provides equity to build these properties. And once you receive an allocation of low-income housing tax credits, you typically have to build the development and have it ready to lease within 24 months of getting that allocation. So it can be very challenging. Like Jessica said, one, to find a site that fits the state's priorities to be competitive for those funds, and then to get through the entitlement process and construct the property to meet those regulatory requirements. I have not worked on a project in the county for, 5 or 6 years, but I have recently closed projects in other jurisdictions in Maryland, one being Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and Howard County. And the entitlement process is anywhere from 12 to 18 months, sometimes 24 months, which can be very challenging. So I think, to help affordable housing developers, I think the county could, come up with some creative ideas to streamline the entitlement process for affordable housing developments, to make those a priority in the development plan approval process. and to, you know, continue to provide payment in lieu of taxes, which is, you know, a pilot for all affordable housing developments in the county, and a reduction or a complete waiver of impact fees and permit fees related to affordable housing, so that we can provide housing for the lower income folks. And then any additional government funds, you know, at lower interest rates would also be a huge benefit. I think, as everybody knows, we're in an environment where construction costs have just continued to increase. We've seen a 40% increase in the last 2 years in construction cost. Interest rates have increased by 2% since January, and we feel that they're just going to continue to increase. So it's just really important to try to come up with some creative solutions, you know, in cutting some of the entitlement fees that the counties charge for affordable housing, and also diverting some local jurisdiction grant money to affordable housing. That's, you know, that's it in a nutshell. It's very challenging to get these deals built. I think it's just becoming more and more. And another thing I just wanted to touch base on, when you about the school capacity, offering, you know, exempting the school capacity issue for 50 units and less. It's hard to build a property under, you know, I'd say it's 60 units. I don't know if Jessica agrees, because it's just getting harder and harder to sustain these properties long term as far as operating them, you know, as salaries just aren't staying up with inflation. So we cannot increase our rents enough to sustain these properties long term. So we have to start looking at building more density just to sustain them long term.
No, I completely agree. I mean, it's really not in the county's interest to have communities that can't fund capital improvements and proper maintenance and proper staffing. And really I would have told you the threshold for that was, you know, maybe 70 units or 80 units. And it really has become closer to 100 plus to truly have the money that you need to do your capital repairs, have the right people hired and on site. It's become uniquely expensive.
Well, great. Are you both able to now take questions? Was that the end of your pieces?
Sure. I think we did have our couple communities, if you wanted to see that real quick.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, absolutely.
Diane, I think Berger's up.
This is Berger Square in Odenton. It's a 48 unit property for families. And we do have some units set aside for disabled folks. We were fortunate, and this property was already through its development plan approval process when we purchased the land from the seller. But I think it still took 12 months to get through the entitlement process to get our permits approved. But it stays occupied. Because of its size, it is a little bit challenging to operate, you know, to sustain the operations, but it's doing well. And this is a property that we built in Glen Burnie. It's Glen Forest, 70 units for senior housing. And it continues to stay occupied with a wait list.
Oh no, did my picture not come up? Do I have a picture on the next one?
Yes.
I tried so hard to get a site plan on here and I couldn't crop it. So this is actually the Eagle Park project that I was talking about. It's on Rockenbach Road. It is adjacent to the fort. It's right at the entrance, the Rockenbach Road entrance to Fort Meade. So what you're seeing here is essentially the senior building. So the building out into the background, the 4-story building is an elevated building. It's age restricted, 72 units, financed with the low-income housing tax credit program and some state loan funds. And then on the next slide is Eagle Park Village, and this is 48 units of general occupancy housing, also financed with low-income housing tax credits and state loan funds, and also ACDS has given a loan commitment as well to the project. And I tried to crop our site plan to show you the site plan, but I just could not quite figure that out. But this is the project that I was talking about, where we literally have 2 separate halves. So we have created 2 parcels. We had 1 parcel, and we have created 2 entrances off of the state road, Rockenbach Road, which is not cheap to get 2 entrances from a state road. So we now have, 2 completely separate communities. We have a community building and a playground for Eagle Park Village. And then we have Eagle Park Vistas, which is the senior side, has its own separate parking and community facilities and primarily interior amenities. So this one has been really interesting. It is very close. We're actually with ACDS right now for confirmation of us meeting the workforce housing regulations, the portion that they confirm. And we have our comments on our final site plan with OPZ right now that we're trying to resubmit. So we're very close to I think getting the first approval for a workforce housing conditional use project in the county. It has been a long and challenging process. So this property is part of the Parkside mixed use development. And we were able to work, this actually is right at the tip of Councilman Pruski's district. But the majority of Parkside is actually in Councilmember Lacey's district. And so she was really our champion in trying to help us through this. And she helped us with a change to the mixed use zoning, because this site was approved for office when we found it. And I think we all know what the market is for office right now. And if it is right at the mouth of Fort Meade and has not had office built on it in 10 years, it's probably not good office ground, I think is the assumption. So we were able to work with OPZ, Councilmember Lacey, and we were able to get some legislation done that essentially drops the floor for office in our mixed use zoning classification, which allowed us to essentially substitute workforce housing square footage for this office use. So it has been quite a complicated project, but it is taking advantage of the school APFO exemption for the 48 family units, because it's, I think it's the middle school that's closed now. It was open when we went in and for our funding, and now it's closed. So it has been, we started working on this in 2019. And this is where we are. And to Diane's point, I mean, we filed our, we actually spent quite a bit of time, and I really appreciate all the brain damage that Steve Kaisigler did with us too in trying to work through this. But we started working on this. I think we put our site plan in, our sketch plan in May of 21, but we spent probably 9 months working on the legislation that we needed and just, trying to get interpretations from the law office so that we could move forward with a submission that would generally be accepted.
What will the rent be at Eagle Park? Like what will like a typical 1 or 2 bedroom rent?
So, one of the things that I think would probably come up in some of the questions and the conversations we have, because it's been really talked about at the school APF meetings is, so our family phase is all 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, and 4 bedrooms. And that has a lot to do with the state's requirements and their scoring system. So we have, and because this is competitively financed, our rents are much lower because we're meeting 30% renters and 40% renters and 50% renters. Whereas in our senior building, it is all 60% units because it is non-competitively financed. And then of course that's 1 and 2 bedrooms because it's an age restricted population. But what you see with, particularly with the competitive projects, the competitive tax credit projects, they're large unit sizes because that is what is preferred from the state.
And then can you just so that way we all have an idea, what is the general ballpark for how much would be charged for rent?
Sure. So at the 30% level, the rents are going to be somewhere between $700 and $1,000, depending upon the unit size. For the 50%, I believe we have 30% and 50% here. To the 50%, those are going to be more like $900 to $1,500 for 3 bedrooms. And then on the senior side, the 60% rents, I think we're at $1,200 for the 1 bedroom, and the 2 bedroom were around $1,450.
So do you have any other properties you wanted to show, or should we go ahead and move into questions?
Questions are fine with me.
Okay, great. So if members of the SAC could use the raise hand function, I can't see everybody because we're in the presentation. So either close down the PowerPoint or folks. Yep. Okay. So while we wait for that, Keisha, looks like you have a question. So I'll let Keisha Baird ask our first question.
Thank you. Okay, so one of my questions relates to, you mentioned that there is a challenge in terms of finding land within the Region 2 that I guess you can potentially see as like having a development opportunity. I guess what areas, because it looks like you guys located something near Fort Meade that you were able to develop into a property that was able to have significant units. What areas do you foresee within our region that we might be able to rezone and maybe rezone it from whatever, I don't know what zoning it is, but potentially rezone it to mixed use, which it sounds like was helpful?
So I think the biggest issue is schools, right? And I'm trying to look, I know we're in, our particular property is in Meade. And if you are in Meade Middle, then there's no general occupancy, right? If you're with MacArthur Middle and you have one of the 6 elementary schools that are open, then you have a shot at being able to do general occupancy. So I think that's probably the biggest issue is, the state does prefer with its financing, they prefer to see general occupancy communities. So the schools are going to continue to hamper the county's ability to be competitive. So I think that's one really important issue. I believe, and I think Carrie shared this with us in prep for this, you all had had a presentation that showed, I want to say it was with Fort Meade removed, I think you had less than 2% of the land in Region 2 was R22.
I've offhand, I believe it's closer to 6%.
6%.
But it's
still small.
Small, yeah.
It's still small.
And I think I would say, just to add on to that, having larger parcels to fit, like, between 80 and 100 units.
Gotcha. Nicole, you have a question?
Thank you. I apologize for being late. This senior housing that you have at Eagle, what is the age going to be? Is it 50, 55, 60? What is the age?
So the zoning would allow us to have 55. We have a financing option that would restrict us to 62. So it will likely be 62. And that's a financing issue.
So that would be the max age or the lowest you would go?
The lowest we can go.
Okay.
But for zoning, it would be 55. And so, if, so our funding would not restrict us to allow a head of household to be 62, but a partner, for example, to be 57. Right. And so that could conceivably happen.
Okay. And your entrances are both going to be off Rockenbach?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you mentioned, I'm curious about this because Two Rivers went through the same thing, right? Over in Watchapel. They started out as senior only. It didn't sell good enough. So then they had to make it family, right? But I don't know that they have two separate entrances. There's only one entrance off of Conway.
I know a little bit about that history, probably enough to be dangerous, but I believe it was already built. And then they came back and asked.
Right.
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 So you couldn't, because yours was starting from the ground up, you couldn't get the same. You had to do that.
Right. I mean, the county's code says that you cannot have age restricted and general occupancy on the same parcel. So we had to meet that.
And you mentioned that you've done, or maybe it was Diane, you did this in other counties. And what I have heard from other folks is it's way easier in other places than here. Has that been your understanding? You mentioned that the timing and the permitting and it takes so long here in this county. Is it easier in other counties like Montgomery and PG and Howard?
Well, I can't speak to Anne Arundel because, like I said, I haven't done a deal recently in Anne Arundel, but I know we just finished one in Prince George's County, which took an exorbitant, all of 18 months probably to get it through the entitlement process. Now, I think, we were doing that during COVID. So I think just with everybody doing their approvals through, Zoom and virtual, it added some time to that process. But probably pre-COVID, I don't think it added much time. And then we did do a deal in Montgomery County. It was an elderly project within a continuum care campus, which was part of a master development plan. And that took some time getting through the permitting process. So I don't think Anne Arundel County is, an anomaly that you're worse than all jurisdictions. I think a lot of the local jurisdictions in the state are, having an extremely long processing time. So I don't.
So we're not any worse than anybody else in terms of this process.
I mean, I guess Jessica could talk more to that, but I think the jurisdictions that I have worked in recently, I would say, have a very long processing time also. I think Howard County is working to streamline their processing time. Of the 3 counties that I've worked in, I'd say that they were working more towards streamlining their processing time.
Okay, and then just to shed some light on the Mead versus MacArthur issue, and I mentioned this to Mr. Kai Ziegler when he did our presentation. The issue with that is MacArthur is behind the gate. So when you have a family that is at MacArthur and the family can't access MacArthur Middle School because they don't have an ID card, that family gets transferred to Mead, which is why Mead is closed. And so that's why you see all this occupancy at MacArthur and no occupancy at Mead. And that's why Mead is traditionally closed every year and has been for decades. And so we need to talk to the base and the people at the fort about moving that gate, because if you move that gate 200 feet, then you don't have this issue about transferring students from MacArthur to Mead, and you don't have this occupancy issue that keeps it closed. And I mentioned that to Mr. Kai Ziegler when he came, and as somebody who has an ID card and has had one for 22 years and has lived here for 22 years, this wouldn't be an issue. And you don't have this issue about transferring kids. We don't have this issue in the elementary schools because there's plenty of them on and off base. But we have this issue with the middle school because of all the surrounding communities in Laurel and out here in Jessup that are 50-50 in terms of who goes to MacArthur and who goes to Meade. It heavily affects our schools in Laurel, our neighborhoods in Laurel. So we have got to talk to the folks on base. It's simply moving that gate so that we have families that can access that school. Minor change, greater resolution for a lot of families.
Great. All right. And Jim, I see you have your hand up.
I had a question regarding the school issue. For those that work in other jurisdictions, and I think there was the school APF work group was mentioned. Are schools handled any different for affordable or workforce housing projects in other jurisdictions that we could look at as perhaps an example for Anne Arundel County?
I can't, outside of the exemption that you all give, I cannot think of a direct affordable housing exemption or incentive. I do think other jurisdictions handle capacity much differently than the county, which I think is really the root of the issue.
Sure. I guess the second part to my question is, with the affordable or workforce housing bill that came out, I guess about 2 years ago, aside from the school exemption for 50 units, are there any other changes to that piece of legislation or the code that you all would like to see that might make life easier for processing these types of projects, or is that just a very lengthy list?
I'm just trying to think through everything that was in that bill because there were a number of things. I think Diane touched on it. I mean, the reduction in the capital charges, I think historically the county has given that to nonprofits and religious organizations, but it is now available to workforce housing. That's a huge issue because the fees are big and they continue to get bigger every year. So that's helpful to the feasibility.
I think it's like 50% for workforce housing, whereas religious facilities it's waived or exempt.
That sounds right.
Sorry, can you clarify if your funding status as a nonprofit or for-profit developer affects that? I was unclear on that.
I thought that nonprofits and religious organizations were completely exempt. I think they used to be, but I know that workforce housing is only 50%. I've never been a nonprofit, so I don't know.
Well, I think, we are a nonprofit, but we do have a for-profit entity that we have to use for the investors, for our tax credit structure. So some counties look at that differently. They see our for-profit entity. They look at our for-profit entity instead of peeling the onion and see that we're a nonprofit. It's just different. It's different in every jurisdiction. But we do, we do have some subsidies available to us as a nonprofit that for-profits don't have. But on the flip side, our charter doesn't allow us to provide market rate units in our properties. We can provide a small amount, but it's very little. So most of our properties are targeted to 60% or below.
Great. Do we have other questions from the SAC? While folks are thinking, I do have one. I know, Jessica, you mentioned that there was some oddball properties and that might help. How do you think the county can change its policies and zoning to allow some of these quote unquote oddball pieces of land to be utilized for different types of housing?
I've sat in a couple meetings with Councilmember Pickard, and I think she's kind of leading the charge on some of these issues because she has Glen Burnie, which I think has a lot of these types of properties. I wish I had a simple answer, but I really think that the county's code is suburban and assumes greenfield, right? And I think that's a huge challenge. I've definitely worked in other jurisdictions that have the same issue, and they see a redevelopment project that they like, but their code absolutely cannot handle it without you going to the BZA, for example. you know? And so I think having some type of redevelopment language that allows some latitude when a site is not a greenfield would help.
And Christina, I think I missed your hand because it was in your logo. Do you have a question?
Sorry, I'm trying to get around the screen. So
No problem.
I wanted to ask a couple questions. I wanted to drill into two things I think I heard, which could lead to some recommendations. So one was from Diane and one was from Jessica. So Diane, you said, so one of the things I heard in general was that the 50 units with the school exemption is really starting, it's becoming unsustainable to do a project of that size. And really now with where we are, it would be better if you all could do, let's say 100 units. I heard Diane say we need larger pieces of property available. And so my question to you is, for 100 units, what is your optimal size piece of property that you want? But before you answer that, I also want to piggyback onto Jessica saying in R22, you're limited to 65% coverage. And my question there is, can you get all of your stormwater, your landscape areas, your forest con in the 35%? Like, what would your dream coverage be for a property? So A, how big of a property? And then what would your dream coverage be that you could actually get everything on that you need as far as stormwater and forest?
And I think that the site and how the forest con provisions apply to it probably weighs pretty heavily into that. We actually did an analysis on the site for Eagle Park when the forest con bill was going on, and because it was grandfathered, it already had forest con easements on it, so we didn't have to meet them. But I mean, we would have. It's an 11-acre site, and we would have probably had 3 acres of buildable area with the coverage and the forest con. So
it sounds like you all would prefer to have some kind of escape valve in forest con for affordable. I don't know that politically that's feasible, but that sounds like what you need.
I think it would help, and I think it would ensure that the county, if it is specific to affordable, I think it would ensure that the county is I guess giving a little on a priority that means a lot to it for a particular policy objective, right? But I do think it would help. I think it would help properties that otherwise could be used for market rate development, which we couldn't afford. Workforce housing becomes the only option. And that's the only way we were able to purchase the property for Eagle Park, was because the owner knew he had no other option. Nobody was going to buy it from him for office. And we put together a plan for him on how we thought we could get workforce housing approved once it became a conditional use. We were his only buyer. And I think that is honestly how we get into the land deals that we do, is by really being the only buyer. So by allowing affordable housing to do things that other types of development can't, it's a way to let us negotiate into a land sale.
But you still needed code changes that were led by Councilwoman Lacey, correct? I mean, it wasn't, you didn't just slide in and it was fabulous. You needed.
No, and the reason was because it was part of an existing mixed use plan. That's why we had such a hard time, is it was part of an existing mixed use plan.
All right. So then to Diane, what size do you think?
Well, in my historic experience, I think we need at least 4 buildable acres, and that's dependent on the parking requirements. It's lately we've been doing podium parking, to meet our parking requirements, so that because of the limited amount of space that we buildable space that we do have.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much.
Great. And Nashara, I believe you have a question.
Okay. Hi. Are you able to hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. So I have two questions. They might be kind of broad. Let me put it right here. It might be kind of broad, but so one of them I wanted to ask was if you could explain a little more about the general occupancy and how the schools affect that. I have never truly heard of that, and I know there's probably a lot of people that have it, and I don't completely understand, I guess, everything about that. But I'm just trying to figure out that part of it a little more, if that makes any sense.
Should I take that? Okay. So general occupancy is essentially anyone can live there. It's not age restricted. So you could conceivably have children, and the zoning code essentially requires that there be school seats available for potential children when it's not age restricted. So if the schools are not available, if there's not seats available for the projected number of children from the development, then we're not able to get approvals and permits.
Okay. And my second question was actually concerning the oddball land. So with that, alongside the income challenges, considering a lot of people do spend more than 30% currently on their housing, is there any more modifications or any push for upcoming code modifications for affordable housing past what we're discussing right now? Or has there been any
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
I think we missed that last part, Nashara. Are you still there?
Yeah, sorry, my signal's really bad. I was saying that
last part. Yeah.
So is there any upcoming code modifications for more ease in building housing? I know she said she tried discussing it with some people and they're having trouble. Oh, my phone's about to die. That's probably why. I'm so sorry.
I'm not aware of any potential affordable housing legislation that has to do with code in the county, but I'm not sure if anybody on staff knows.
Well, the other thing about about passing legislation right now is that it's an election year, so all legislation has to be done in October. We only have one more legislative session, October 17th. And then the new council will be, they will take office on Monday, December 5th, and that will be their first day in office. So the pipeline, we're at the very end of the pipeline right now, and it will restart in December and January.
Okay.
And then of course, any strategies and goals that we make through the Region 2 plan to encourage changes or things like that to be considered is also part of the process, Nashara. So maybe there's nothing in the pipeline yet, but maybe someday soon.
Thank you.
Well, Jessica and Diane, before we wrap up, I'll give you both just a magic wand just for right now, and just tell me, like, what is the one thing each of you that you would change in Anne Arundel County to make it easier to provide more affordable and workforce housing?
Oh, it's a lot of things.
Go for it. You got a magic wand.
Well, I think more funds for sure, and just you know, streamlining the process to make it more time efficient.
Okay.
I would first like to say, you know, somebody who's been involved in the county through several administrations, I mean, this council and this administration have done more for what we do than I've seen in my history in the county. So I think, you know, they've made lots of funds available, far more than we've seen before. The fee waivers, you know, doing the workforce housing conditional use. I think there's been a lot of really positive things that says the county's interested in this from a policy perspective. But if we can't get through the land development process, we still can't build affordable housing, right? Particularly for families, right? So I think, solving the school seat problem is huge. And I do think that the county really needs to consider rewriting its code. And I just say that from a development perspective in general. I think that with the change in administration, the interpretation of the code has changed dramatically. And I think that's been very hard on the development committee. But I also think a code where you have to constantly grant modifications means it's a code that's not working, which was what was happening before, right? And as you have more redevelopment potential, you just need a different code, and your code doesn't currently do that. So schools and the code, I think, are probably the biggest things on my list.
Well, great. Well, thank you both so much for this was very helpful, very educational, and plus we just thank you for all the work you're doing, because I think this is very, very important work as we provide housing for those that are most vulnerable and most needy, but also just for workforce and for young families as they're starting out, because they're a very vibrant part of our community. We really appreciate that. So thank you both.
And thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
So it is 7:25. I know we went a little over, but that's actually perfectly okay because this has been a very important topic for us. But I still think we should take a break. So let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. Allow folks to get a glass of water, take a few steps. So we'll come back at 7:30, and then we'll go into our draft recommendations. So thanks, everyone. All right, 7:30, we'll keep rolling along to keep us on schedule. So thanks everybody for coming back. I did, while we're getting started here, wanted to introduce Chad Jones, who is joining us as an ex officio member from Fort Meade. So Chad, I see you're on. I don't know if you've stepped away or not, but we just wanted to, if you wanted to say hello and introduce yourself quickly, that would be great.
Hey everybody, I am driving back from a town hall, so I figured you wouldn't want to see it, just a dark background of a car. But
no problem.
Yeah, my name is Chad Jones. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at Fort Meade. Been in that position for the better part of 12 years. So as I caught in on the end of the tail end of the last meet, worked a lot with Jessica, the land use issues, and dealt with Mark and other folks. So I am de facto the installations representative for most in community engagement. So doing a lot with the county executive and the county council's office. Also just a longtime member or longtime resident with kids in the Pasadena Northeast clusters. So honored to be here, and hope I can contribute where I can.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been a great group, and we've gotten a lot accomplished in the past 10 months, and we have a lot more to do. So thanks you for joining us. You're joining just the right time. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Mark with OPZ as we kind of go into our next piece with draft recommendations. So Mark?
Yeah, great. So this is the good stuff, right? As we've heard a lot of different perspectives from the different players within the housing industry. And so now what we'd like to do is really just put pen to paper here and start identifying what some of these recommendations could be, things that really do need to change within the code or on a zoning map or elsewhere that could really then help facilitate making housing more affordable or providing some more different types of products out there. So let me go ahead and get this started. Bear with me here. Okay. So I'm going to try to keep some of this context a little brief, but like I said, is what we're really just trying to get our heads around are, what are some of these recommendations? I mean, Joe, you touched on it, is if you had a magic wand, what needs to change so that we can get people in affordable homes and different types of products. So like Mike shared, counties and cities across the country, they're trying to address these issues. And everybody's real estate market and regulations are distinct, but these challenges are essentially the same. So we've heard different examples of communities that might be years ahead of us, months ahead of us, that are trying to address this issue. We can look around the state of Maryland and elsewhere in the country for these different examples. But again, there is no silver bullet. So for example, in the state of Oregon, requiring all local governments to allow duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes in any zoning district. You may have seen headlines saying, that certain municipalities are abolishing single family zoning. That is really just one tool in the toolbox here. And clearly we need a variety of tools to address a variety of issues. So we'll walk through the challenges that we've heard over the past several months. And then if you remember back in June, we put some posters up on the board with some strategies from Plan 2040. And if you had time, you put some dots next to them indicating how much of a priority they are. So let's revisit those in the context of some of the challenges, again, that we've heard. And again, really wanting to hear from you. This is your discussion to just sort of brainstorm and come up with some threads of ideas, or if you have some really firm recommendations that you're married to, we certainly want to hear those. Again, we invite you to put those, if you'd like, yourself up on the Jamboard. That link was circulated earlier, or Carrie's also standing by and she can also add those to the Jamboard as well. So like I said, no silver bullet. We've sort of put or categorized these into 4 different topics. So with county code reforms, we're talking about how to support more housing options. And then in the development review reform, we talked about how to maybe streamline and make some of these, remove any hoops, or again, just make the process much more quicker and reduce any conflicts with project funding. Then looking at financial incentives, how to make affordable housing projects more financially feasible, and then financial support for buyers and renters. Again, this is probably more under the purview of our Arundel Community Development Services, Erin Karpowitz, who we heard from in July with one of her programs. But this would include helping prospective buyers improve their credit scores, financial assistance for down payments or renovations to maintain homes, or support people aging in place. There are strategies in Plan 2040 to address this, but we don't think that this is necessarily, the region plan is necessarily the right spot to sort of build on this, but we can still talk about that as well. So again, the Jamboard is open, looking for some ideas, and we'll start to run through then those challenges and some of those Plan 2040 strategies that addressed or are trying to address some of those challenges, and whether we need to build on them or maybe make them more specific. So talking through some of the more highly ranked items, or the ones that you indicated were more of a priority from that meeting in July. Missing middle, we've talked about that quite a bit. Again, this is one solution we can recommend in the plan to allow for more missing middle types by making changes to the zoning code. Accessory dwelling units, our code, like Mike shared earlier this evening, only allows ADUs that are part of the main structure. Our plan can recommend allowing independent accessory dwelling units in some areas of the region. However, this may only marginally and slowly increase housing diversity over time. We also have the moderately priced dwelling unit program. This is another option for chipping away at housing diversity. As we heard today, however, there needs to be more support for housing for very low income families. So again, that 60% and lower, and an MPDU or MPDU policy might make only marginal gains towards increasing housing diversity and affording for middle income families. But again, still a recommendation we can make in the plan. So looking at the code, code requirements, code restrictions, what are some of the other things that we heard this evening that could help get at making things easier for affordable housing or the different types of products out there.
So was Lacey's legislation just a one-off for her project, or was that the bill that allows the mixed-use residential within 4 miles of the fort?
So say that again.
So was Lacey's legislation a one-off for the Eagle project, or was that the one that allows for mixed-use residential within 4 miles of the fort?
Well, I can't necessarily speak for her, but I think, you know, these are attempts by our decision makers to respond to these and open up more tools for providing these products, acknowledging that there is this need for housing.
Because if what she already did, allowing that change, then that may address some of this here, is what I was getting at. You know what I'm saying? Remember that bill that we got all upset about earlier?
Mm-hmm.
So that may address some of this here by allowing that within 4 miles of any boundary of Fort Meade.
So are you saying, Nicole, look at making workforce or affordable housing like an allowable use in those areas? Is that what you're?
Correct.
Okay.
Within that legislation that was already passed that we weren't happy about.
Right. And that's, I can't say for certain, but I believe Jessica said that the development she was talking about had gotten started around 2019. So we'll look into whether or not these two legislations are different, but just to clarify what your idea is, and I think it's one that they said too, would be to allow workforce and affordable housing as a permitted use in some of these other categories, mixed use, right?
Because I know that mixed use was specifically mentioned in that legislation, which is why it triggered my thought.
Right. And I think the thing that they mentioned during the meeting tonight was allowing the office requirement be flexible. So if a developer can't meet the office requirement, they can supplement with workforce housing or affordable housing.
Which is exactly what a lot of that land is that they're talking about, which is why it makes me think about this.
Yeah, so I'll add that to our Jam board. I know this PowerPoint isn't dynamic, it's static, obviously, but I'm going to throw that onto the board right now so that we're sure to capture that. And just so you know, we also put the gate recommendation. So, and
then along that thing, I don't know if we're going to get to that in here, but we need a middle school out here. So that's been an issue for 20, how many years, Joe? 25. We've needed a middle school in Region 2. So there's a parcel of land behind Russet that the Board of Education already owns. And then there's a parcel of land behind Jessup Elementary that the Board of Education already owns. That is perfectly suitable. It's already been looked at or what have you. So there's 2 parcels of land that the Board of Education already own that is suitable for a middle school. And it's been looked at for years. So that's the other issue. And
so in that regard, are you talking about then the adequate public facilities and
correct
how that can alleviate?
Correct. The middle school has been an issue for years, and the middle school continues to be closed. Now, moving the gate is one solution, yes, but the middle school has continually been an issue as long as Joe and I have lived out here, 20-something years. The elementary schools wax and wane, but the middle school has continually been an issue. So if an elementary school is an issue, you take one and put an elementary school on it, and you take the other and put a middle school on it, and it solves the problem. But we continue to be forgotten out here. They continue to build in Severna Park. They continue to build Crofton High School. They're building up in Old Mill and what have you, but they continually neglect Region 2 as long as Joe and I have lived out here. And it needs to be addressed. They continue. We have been on the 10-year plan 3 times, and they continue to neglect it. They need to stop neglecting it and build it. Yes, they built Jessup Elementary and increased capacity a smidge, and Meade High School got a big chunk of money for beautification, but they added 0 capacity to it. And that does no good.
So I've added that to the board for the draft, and we've caught that idea. And I think Mark's going to pull the board up so that we can see that instead of looking at the static PowerPoint.
Because you have all these new developments out here. You have Shipley Shipley Homestead, whatever that new one is on the corner of 175 where the man's farm was. And that has a ton of homes. And then you have Parkside. And then you have the ones that are coming off of Wiggly. So you have all these homes that are coming that are going to have children. And then you have Jim Craps developed Watershed. You have all these homes and all these kids that are coming, and you have no capacity for these kids.
Keisha, were you going to say something? I thought I saw you raise your hand. Or...
Yeah, I had some ideas I was wondering about. So I heard them mention something about the R22 zone land is that they need more of that. So do we have an opportunity? Because I kind of took notes that said like 22 dwelling units per 1 acre, but 65% lot coverage. Could we change the R22 zone to allow for, I guess, more development and I guess reduce the lot coverage requirements or adjust that somehow in order to accommodate more units? Is there a way we could do that?
You can make recommendations that be done. It's up to the county council to approve any amendments to the zoning code or the subdivision and development code.
So can we put that as an idea then?
Absolutely.
And okay, so that was
oh,
go ahead.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Can the SAC make recommendations for a higher density zoning? So above R22?
Yes, they can do that. And the other thing is, you know, a catch-all language would be something like overall review of zoning and subdivision and development code language to remove barriers to affordable housing. You might start with a general, something like a general umbrella, and then you could identify things that you think specifically should be evaluated for change. You know, Jessica Zuniga said multiple times, our code is very suburban in nature, and it's really, it does a good job for developing green fields. Okay, so what it sounds like to me is we need to be leaning a little bit more urban in order to get some of this development. What kind of recommendation would we make in order to achieve that?
And this sort of then goes hand in hand with the comprehensive zoning update, which we'll do in early 2023 with you all. Is we're just trying to get some of this language down of what the recommendation or the direction we want to go. And then we can talk about if any areas potentially around transit might need to be upzoned to help facilitate some of these recommendations.
And
so
when we say upzoned, we mean, so R22 is our most dense zoning. Now, when Dan Perolik was here, who wrote the Missing Middle book, he flatly said to us, R22 is not enough. And it's in the very beginning of his book. So, and if you think about it, your transit areas, you really want to be your highest density, and then your missing middle can transition away from those denser areas. So those are some recommendations that the group could make. The other thing is, you all, Region 2 is leaning into this, I think, more heavily than I've seen the other two regions. But you may end up kind of being the vanguard on this issue, because I think that if we make changes to the zoning code, they're going to be for the whole county. So if you really lean into this, you could end up influencing policy that will affect the entire county, which would be a good thing.
Christina, related to the taxes and some of these other things, on average, how much does it cost to do one of these affordable housing projects? Do you know?
That I cannot answer you, but another big issue that I think is worth discussing. So if you have land that was originally envisioned to be mixed use and only a small portion residential, definitely you need more sewer and water capacity for residential, especially larger multifamily apartments, than you do for, let's say, commercial or office, right? When you go to an office environment, I mean, we want offices to have showers so people can bike to work and get a shower when they're there, but how many offices really have showers? They don't. So the usage of sewer and water in office is low, it's lower in commercial. When you go to residential, you need more sewer and water. Jessica said the pipe, you know, going by this property was not big enough. So upgrading sewer and water is huge, huge engineering expense because they need bigger diameters to handle the incoming public water and the outgoing public sewer. I, off the top of my head right now, do not know what I would recommend for that, but whether it be because a lot of times the developers actually have to do the upgrades to serve their own developments. So one question is how we can either defray those costs if we think that's important enough. Now, the pilot program, and I don't know a ton about pilot programs, but that is the payment in lieu of taxes. There are special agreements that are approved by the county council. I know that in the past year or two, the council has approved some for affordable projects, but the developers say they really need those in order to be able to do their projects because it affects how it affects when payments have to be made. So that, you know, a recommendation about continuing or expanding pilot availability in Anne Arundel County, that might be something you want to do. And we can look at, no, I don't know cost. And, you know, you don't have to get specific. I don't feel like you have to get specific because although we could do some research to try and figure out what is being offered in other counties to see if we could make a similar recommendation.
I just wanted to look at what would be a better cost effective for them versus cost effective for the county. Was it the impact fees? Was it the pilot? Was it this water and sewer? If we were going to give them something or a combination thereof, I wanted to see the cost versus benefit to them and the county to weigh this out and see what kind of a package deal we could do here.
Have they left the meeting or are the developers still on?
I believe they left.
They left. Okay. I think
Yeah.
we would need their help in answering that question.
Mark Thompson, do you know the answer to that off the top of your head?
I don't.
We can follow up with them, Nicole, and ask for some fiscal analysis if they
Even
have
a ballpark number would be helpful, just so that if we were to put a package together or to make a recommendation, we knew like what kind of numbers we would be throwing out to the county if we're going to make these recommendations.
I think it's important, as Christina said about like this is Mike Stringer from Planning and Zoning, getting on the details of like the specific quantities. You know, that would be a follow-on, you know, implementation measure that there would need to be a fiscal analysis, but to kind of get the ideas on the table. And some of these things like the pilot are also mentioned in Plan 2040. So there's precedent in that policy setting document for this as well. But I think we can definitely follow up with them and ask them qualitatively, which ones. But I think from looking at other counties that have conducted fiscal impact studies related to affordable housing and taking that next step of detail, they still end up with all the above framework of saying that, it's a little bit here and a little bit there to make it all work.
Yeah, because
Mark,
for instance, if you have an R22 zone piece of property, it may already have adequate sewer and water infrastructure leading to the property. Jessica raised it in the context of the mixed use development, which doesn't anticipate the kind of sewer and water needs that residential needs, because residential is a small percentage. So it could be an issue for one property, but not for another, depending on what's happening. So it is hard, and that's why I think just you make as many recommendations as you can. They probably are not all implementable, but if you get a percentage of them implemented, you've gone a long way. And everything starts in the planning documents and then it works into regulation. So it's got to first be in the planning documents, and that's why these processes are so important.
Mark, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to throw out there was we heard from Jessica, I think, was having some exemptions from APFO, or I know there's an exemption for 50 units, but maybe increase that exemption. And also if there was some way to, the other area that she mentioned was really having or has a pretty dramatic impact, and it does, is the forest conservation, which I know both of those aren't necessarily politically popular, but if there's some sort of for affordable housing exemption or lowering of the standards, something to that effect, that might be helpful in moving some of these projects along.
Mark, can you explain to me the Forest Con? Yeah, can you explain to me the Forest Con related to what the issue is with these? So you have to have so many acres of trees on these affordable housing projects, just like you would a regular residential projects. Is that the issue?
Yes. And in many cases, just given the types of sites that they're available, as she said in her example, they were grandfathered under older forest conservation legislation, but if they were subject to the new legislation or the more recently passed legislation, it would have reduced their buildable area dramatically. So there's a lot of nuances to that, but that's in essence it.
Hey, Nicole. For forest conservation, that act has been around since the early 90s, and the way it regulates property is through a worksheet that takes into consideration how much forest is on site, and then depending on the zoning, there's an afforestation threshold and a conservation threshold that are dictated by the zoning of the property. And you run that worksheet, and that tells you, what you can clear without mitigation. If you go beyond a certain point, you may have to provide substantially more mitigation. So I think what Mark is recommending is either lowering the thresholds for affordable housing for forest conservation or some other type of exemption that could be built in.
Right. So like she was saying, if it's a non-conforming property, like these parcels that are traditionally utilized for affordable housing, making the recommendation to lower the threshold.
Yeah, I mean, I heard her say that too. And Jim put his hand up right as I was talking, so I'd be interested to get his perspective because he deals with forest conservation all the time.
We do. Thanks, Christina. I guess the one thought I had, maybe it's getting too deep in the weeds on the subject as opposed to sticking with just the concept, is that worksheet not only talks about types of zoning, but also mentions, priority funding areas and targeted growth areas.
Okay.
Perhaps one approach could be offering a targeted growth area retention amount or threshold amount for properties that are considering affordable housing uses that may not otherwise be in that overlay. And that would probably reduce thresholds from 5 to 10%. I mean, just back of the envelope, but that could be a tool that's used without having to recraft the code too much.
Okay, staff can look at that and come back with what might be a reasonable recommendation. I cut my teeth as a young planner in the 90s doing forest conservation for Queen Anne's County, but I'm going to admit to you, I haven't done real implementation in probably a decade. So we can dig into it.
I know we're running close. Jim, did you have anything else? I know we asked you a question, but you also had your hand up. So did you?
No, that was it. That was just a thought on the subject for forest con.
Great. So Mark, I know we're running up at the top of the hour. So what do you think are some good ways we can kind of wrap this up? And then I know you want to talk a little bit about next steps in future meetings before we close up.
Right. So right, we touched on the importance of missing middle and trying to drill down deeper here on our Jamboard and ADUs and MPDUs. We also then slightly touched on, the zoning map update and how the recommendation from Plan 2040 was just making sure that we have more land zone for multifamily around our communities of opportunity, our transit oriented areas, as well as around existing infrastructure. And I think the committee is all on board with that. And I think we have some additional items here on the Jamboard that take us a little bit deeper into that Plan 2040 recommendation. Then let's see, did we add some additional items on the Jamboard that talk about the process? So development review process.
They're on page 2.
Got it. Okay, so if I move,
or sorry, page 3. Page 2 is
3.
blank for additional ideas.
Sure. So again, I'll just throw it out there, talking about development review process, as well as then vesting for schools and that time frame. So Joe, did you want to open it up for just a couple more minutes talking about that? And then I can also just throw in the last grouping here of financial incentives.
Sure.
So if you all want to chat again for a few minutes about the process as well as financial incentives to, again, get us to that goal. Or have we already covered it in what's already posted up on the Jamboard, and some of the other items that we've talked about?
Looks like we might have covered it.
Okay. All right. Let me switch back over to the PowerPoint because I do want to bring up a slide for next steps, or really just the QR code here for our visioning survey. So bear with me for one more minute. Okay. Okay. So again, just to remind everyone, we have our visioning questionnaire that's currently up. You can find that up on our website, aacounty.org/region2. And that is now open through November 1st. And we are asking the SAC members to work your channels, places of worship, friends, family, neighbors. Please do help get the word out about that.
We have large posters that we can provide to you if you're doing any in-person engagement. I know a lot of people's events got canceled last weekend because of the hurricane. So if you have more opportunities, but please let us know what materials you need. You need anything to help get the word out.
Yeah, I think we're in a bit of an advantage this time than we were doing the last set of polling from the public, in that the just general public, due to COVID, more open, people are out doing stuff. There's more street fest going on, farmers markets, corn mazes, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So I think anybody, and I think, you know, we've really pointed out that it really helps if you're doing something in person versus just sending out emails. Definitely post this to your social media and push it that way, but there is just something about having it at a public event and having people take action there.
Yeah, and if you need, again, write half-page flyers, we can get them out to you all. If you are looking to do some type of event, or if you've got a meeting coming up, or just fellowship as part of your, again, where you worship, happy to provide you those physical resources as well. So then looking ahead, so the questionnaire will close November 1st, and then our next meeting won't be until November 17th. We'll be in person at the Severn Library. Right now, our tentative time is 6:15. We acknowledge that it takes some folks some time to travel to when we do meet in person. So we'll be looking forward to meeting everybody in person at 6:15 there at the Severn Library. And we'll be talking about then visioning. Sort of that'll give the Office of Planning and Zoning some time to review all the responses from the questionnaire and start to create some type of some materials that you all can work off of. What I'm going to throw out there, our Region 7 team is looking to create a subcommittee to sort of work on some of the responses and crafting their own vision statement from that, and some visioning from the CERT or from the questionnaire as part of a subcommittee. So again, this would be our first opportunity to work to identify some individuals that would want to work on this subcommittee. Is that something you all would want to do, or would you rather just at our November 17th meeting look at all the data together and come up with some type of vision statement at that time?
That's a good question. Definitely, what are folks' thoughts on that?
So do they want to do a vision statement as a county or each region?
So we would be doing this as each region, right? So if we were to create a subcommittee, forget the subcommittee idea just for a second, is for this region plan, there will be a vision statement, right? And so the question is, for Region 2, do we want to create our own subcommittee to create that vision statement for the region plan? Or would you like to create it all together at that meeting on the 17th? The subcommittee would still present it at that meeting on the 17th.
Can we just do it at the meeting on the 17th?
All together, that is one option. The other option is creating that subcommittee.
I agree.
To work on beforehand.
I would support doing it together.
Agreed.
Okay.
All right. Hearing no other side of that, we'll stick with that unless folks feel strongly otherwise. But yeah, I think it sounds like we're all in agreement. We'll just do it on 17th.
Okay, very good. And then again, looking ahead into December, we understand everybody might be busy with the holidays, so we'll take we'll give you all a break. but the Office of Planning and Zoning will be working to create these recommendations that we then plan on presenting to everybody in January. So again, sort of looking at this, 2022 was the year of background reports and material and education materials and just a discussion of these concepts. And then 2023 here is where we actually get to review what those recommendations are going to be in the plan, as well as then looking ahead to February and beyond is where we'll actually have some maps available of where some of these actual recommendations can be implemented through the zoning map as well as our planned land use map. Okay.
Great. Yeah, and I know that that's a little different than we originally presented in February, where I think we said we were going to actually have meetings every 2 weeks in November and December. But I think we all realized that we put a lot of work in this year. We should pat ourselves on the back. We've done some tremendous work both in person and online. And, we know that December will be a good way for people to take time to really consider what we've done. And then we can come back in January. So I think that that's a smart move for us as a SAC to do it that way. And then, like I said, we're thanks to the staff at the county level who will be working hard in December. So that way, when we come back in January, we have some really good workable products to move from.
So again, that's all I've got then for next steps.
Great. All right, any final questions or issues? I know we're running over, but we do have some folks from the public. Let me make sure they're still there. So yeah, I mean, we are like running over. So if someone from the attendee side would like to make a comment, we're definitely going to leave it to just a minute. So definitely I'm going to cut you off if it's that. I don't know if anybody has any comments from the attendee side. Yeah, it looks like Gary, you have your hand up. I think we're getting you unmuted, Gary. Sorry. Gary, can we hear you now?
Can you hear me?
There we go, Gary. We can hear you.
Well, there's some opportunities in Jessup. So we have a general membership coming up at the end of the month. We have big opens. Don't have one in October. We're going to have one in November. So that's an opportunity to mingle with the community. Another event that I think it'd be nice if some people show up is we have a Halloween trunk or treat 29th. That'll have a lot of people. So those are some opportunities if people would want to come over, and if you have posters or whatever, and be able to interface with the public. That was just a couple of ideas I had.
That's great. Gary, thank you, Gary.
I emailed Ellen and you guys and asked to send out the thing to the JIA. Did you get the email?
I saw it. I didn't verify she sent it out. I think she did.
Okay.
The other thing we do have is fortunately we just got a $40,000 LED sign, so we can put notices on it there of meetings and things like that. So that's another resource to get information out that we can give John Alexa, inputs on what we want to put up there.
Great. We have a very short URL that you can use to market the survey, Gary, and I'll follow up with you on that. And if you don't mind advertising the survey, that'd be awesome.
Well, yeah, I mean, we'll have, I suspect our general membership meeting at the end of the month will be pretty well attended. We have election of officers and, a lot of things. We haven't had a general membership meeting in ages, so I think it'll be well attended, and that'd be a good time for a couple of people to show up. Nicole was nice enough that actually came to our last meeting, and Mark came, and I think that was very informative to people, and people appreciated that.
And
Great.
Carrie, Mark, I sent it out to the HOA where I live, to 45 homes in an email blast, and it's going out weekly to the Russet email as well. So that's another 300 and something, or what is it going to go? I don't know, some 1,800 homes in Russet.
We also have a lady over in Magnolia Creek that's willing to post things on their community board, HOA board. And I don't know what their number, I think their number, well, I guess it's about 70 homes over there. So that's a good distribution too.
Nice.
That's all.
Great. All right. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's a great conversation. I'm not surprised that we went over because we've had so much interest in this topic. So thanks to staff for putting this together. Got really, really great speakers today. And thanks to Michael as well for joining us again. So hope everyone has a great October, has a wonderful and safe Halloween season, and we will see you in November. Thanks, everybody.